The first gunshot rang through the air like thunder, shattering the stillness of the Wyoming prairie as Abram Forrester pressed his back against the weathered bark of a cottonwood tree, his breath coming in short, painful bursts. The bullet had only grazed his shoulder, but the warm trickle of blood seeping through his woolen shirt told him how close he'd come to meeting his maker on this cold autumn morning in 1878. "Come on out, Forrester," a voice called, the words carried on the wind. "Ain't no use in hiding. We know you're here somewhere." Abram's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his side, his fingers brushing against the worn handle. 3 bullets left, not nearly enough for the 5 men hunting him through the foothills outside Evanston, Wyoming. A town he'd once called home before everything went to hell. His horse had gone down a mile back, shot out from under him. The poor beast's screams still echoed in his mind as Abram had rolled away from the falling animal, scrambling for cover as more bullets kicked up dirt around him. Now he was on foot, wounded and running out of options. "You can't run forever." The voice belonged to Marshall Davies, a man who'd once shared whiskey with Abram at the Rusty Nail Saloon. Now the lawman wanted him dead or in chains. Abram closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. 5 years as a Texas Ranger had taught him patience. 5 more years as a bounty hunter had taught him survival. But nothing had prepared him for the loneliness that had consumed him these past 2 years, turning him into the cold, silent man who now pressed his body against rough bark, listening for approaching footsteps. "I'll wait them out," he whispered to himself, a habit born from too many nights alone under the stars. "They'll give up by nightfall." As the sun began its slow descent behind the Uinta Mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Abram's prediction proved true. The voices of his pursuers grew distant, then disappeared altogether. Still, he waited until the first stars appeared before moving, his muscles stiff from remaining motionless for hours. The wound on his shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the pain radiated down his arm. He needed shelter, supplies, and time to heal, none of which would be found in Evanston, not anymore. Not after what happened. Navigating by starlight, Abram moved north, away from town and deeper into the rugged country that few settlers dared to claim. Stories of harsh winters and hostile Shoshone kept most pioneers to the established routes, but Abram knew better. The Shoshone had mostly moved to reservations years ago, and as for the winters, well, he'd survived worse. By dawn, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. His vision blurred as he stumbled through a dense grove of aspens, their white trunks glowing like ghostly sentinels in the early morning light. When he emerged into a small clearing and spotted the cabin, Abram first thought it might be a mirage. The structure was simple. Rough-hewn logs stacked and chinked with mud, a stone chimney rising from one end, and a small porch facing east toward the rising sun. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no sounds came from within. It appeared abandoned, a perfect shelter for a man on the run. Drawing his revolver, Abram approached cautiously. The floorboards of the porch creaked beneath his weight as he reached for the door handle. It turned easily in his hand, the door swinging inward on surprisingly well-oiled hinges. "Hello," he called softly, squinting into the dimness. "Anyone home?" The silence that greeted him was answer enough. Stepping inside, Abram surveyed the cabin's interior. A single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with provisions, and a narrow bed in one corner. Simple but clean and well-maintained. Someone lived here, but they were currently absent. Closing the door behind him, Abram made a quick decision. He would rest, tend to his wound, and be gone before the owner returned. It wasn't ideal, but with the marshal and his men still hunting him, options were scarce. He found clean linens in a chest at the foot of the bed, and used them to bandage his shoulder after washing the wound with water from a bucket near the hearth. The exertion left him light-headed, and despite his intention to remain alert, Abram soon found himself sinking onto the edge of the bed, his eyelids growing heavy. "Just for a moment," he murmured, lying back against the surprisingly soft mattress. "Just to catch my breath." Sleep claimed him instantly, pulling him down into blackness. The sound of the door opening jerked Abram from his slumber. His hand flew to his side, but his revolver was gone, placed on the table before he'd tended his wound. Cursing silently, he sat up, wincing at the pain that shot through his shoulder. Framed in the doorway stood a woman, her silhouette outlined by the afternoon sun at her back. A shotgun was balanced in her hands, not quite pointed at him, but not pointed away either. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't put a hole in you right now," she said, her voice steady and clear. Abram raised his hands slowly, palms outward. "Madam, I apologize for the intrusion. I was injured and needed shelter." She stepped forward, closing the door with her foot while keeping the shotgun level. Now that she was inside, Abram could see her properly. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid and green eyes that regarded him with suspicion. Her dress was simple but clean, covered by a leather hunting vest with multiple pockets, not a typical frontier woman's attire. "You're bleeding on my bed," she observed flatly. "Again, my apologies. I intended to be gone before you returned. And yet, here you are." She moved further into the cabin, keeping a cautious distance. "You have a name, stranger?" "Abram Forrester." She nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. "The one they're hunting. The marshal had men at my trading post this morning, showing your likeness around." Abram tensed. "And you're going to turn me in?" "Haven't decided yet." She leaned the shotgun against the wall, though still within easy reach, and removed her hat. "I'm Grace Norwood. This is my cabin, and you're trespassing?" "I understand, Miss Norwood." "If you'll just allow me to gather my things, I'll be on my way." "Without a horse, with that shoulder?" she scoffed, moving to the fireplace where a pot hung from a hook. "You wouldn't make it 5 miles before collapsing." "Then the wolves would have you, and I'd have to listen to them howling all night over their meal." Abram blinked, unsure how to respond to her blunt assessment. "I've got stew," she continued, lifting the lid and releasing the aroma of meat and herbs into the small space. "Eat something, then we'll talk about what's to be done with you." "Why would you help me?" Abram asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "You know they're looking for me." Grace turned, studying him with those penetrating green eyes. "Because contrary to what the marshal might claim, I don't believe you killed those people in Evanston." "You don't know me." "I know enough." She ladled stew into a wooden bowl. "I know the Abram Forrester who came through my trading post every few months, was quiet but fair. Always paid in full, never caused trouble. That doesn't sound like a man who'd shoot up a saloon for no reason." She approached, holding out the bowl. After a moment's hesitation, Abram took it, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Eat," she instructed. "Then rest. Marshal Davies won't come this far north. He thinks I'm just a crazy woman living alone in the wilderness. You're safe for now." With that, she turned away, busying herself with tasks around the cabin, leaving Abram to stare at her back in bewildered gratitude. The stew was rich and hearty, filled with venison, wild onions, and potatoes. Abram hadn't realized how hungry he was until the first spoonful touched his lips. He devoured the meal, watching Grace as she moved about the cabin with efficient grace, tidying and organizing. "Why do you live out here alone?" he asked eventually, setting aside the empty bowl. She paused in her work, her back to him. "Same reason most people head west, I suppose, to get away from something." Then, without elaborating, she changed the subject. "Your wound needs proper tending." "Take off your shirt." Abram hesitated, but the commanding tone in her voice brooked no argument. Carefully, he removed his blood-stained garment, revealing the hastily applied bandage beneath. Grace gathered supplies from a cabinet: clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and a small wooden box. She pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, her expression professional as she unwrapped his makeshift dressing. "Not as bad as it could be," she observed, examining the furrow where the bullet had grazed his flesh. "But it needs cleaning. This will hurt." Before he could prepare himself, she poured whiskey over the wound. Abram hissed through clenched teeth, his hand instinctively grabbing her wrist. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. "Sorry," he muttered, releasing her. "Caught me by surprise." "Most things that hurt do," she replied softly, returning to her task. Her fingers were gentle despite her brusque manner, carefully cleaning the wound before applying a paste from her wooden box. It smelled of herbs and honey, and the coolness provided immediate relief from the burning pain. "Medicine woman taught me," she explained, catching his questioning look. "Spent time with the Shoshone when I first came out here. They were kind enough to share some knowledge before moving on." As she worked, Abram studied her face, the light dusting of freckles across her nose, the small scar above her right eyebrow, the determined set of her jaw. There was strength there, but also a wariness that spoke of past hurts. "Why are you really helping me?" he asked as she finished bandaging his shoulder. Grace stood, gathering her supplies. "Maybe I'm just tired of being alone," she admitted, her back to him once more. "Or maybe I believe a man deserves a fair chance before being judged. Either way, you can stay until that shoulder heals, provided you earn your keep. I'm not running a charity here." "I understand." She nodded once, then pointed to a chest in the corner. "There are clean shirts in there. My late father's, they should fit well enough. Get some rest." Tomorrow comes early in these parts. As darkness fell, Abram found himself lying on a pallet near the fireplace, having insisted Grace keep her bed. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a lonely sound that had been his only companion for too long. Inside the cabin, the soft sounds of Grace's breathing created a strange counterpoint, a reminder that, at least for now, he wasn't alone. He stared at the dancing shadows on the ceiling, wondering about the woman who had shown him unexpected kindness. What had driven her to this solitary existence? What was she running from? Questions without answers, much like his own situation. The irony wasn't lost on him, the cold, solitary hunter now dependent on the mercy of another lone soul in the wilderness. As sleep began to claim him once more, Abram's last thought was that perhaps this cabin might offer shelter from more than just his physical pursuers. The next morning brought pale sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window and the scent of coffee brewing over the fire. Abram opened his eyes to find Grace already dressed and busy at her small stove, her back to him as she worked. "You snore," she informed him without turning around. "Not loudly, but enough to know you were still alive through the night." Abram sat up, running a hand through his dark hair. "Sorry about that. Don't be. It's been a while since I've heard another person's breathing in this cabin." She glanced over her shoulder, a hint of something almost like amusement in her eyes. "Coffee, please." She poured the steaming liquid into a tin cup and brought it to him. "How's the shoulder?" Abram rotated it carefully, wincing slightly. "Better than it has any right to be, thanks to your ministrations." "Good." She nodded, businesslike once more. "Because there's wood that needs chopping, and I expect you'll want to earn that breakfast I'm fixing." Despite the pain in his shoulder, Abram found himself smiling, the first genuine smile to cross his face in months. "Yes, madam." After a breakfast of cornbread and dried apple preserves, Abram followed Grace outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of approaching winter. From the porch, he could see that the cabin sat in a small meadow surrounded by dense forest, with a clear view of the mountains to the west. A stream burbled nearby, and a small barn stood about 50 yards from the main structure. "It's beautiful," Abram said, taking in the scene. "It's remote," Grace corrected, though her tone suggested she appreciated the beauty as well, which has its advantages and disadvantages. She led him to a chopping block where several logs awaited splitting. "I usually do this myself, but since you're here..." Abram picked up the axe, testing its weight and balance. "You maintain this place all on your own. I've been doing it for 3 years now." She crossed her arms, watching him. "Think a woman can't handle frontier life without a man?" "Not at all," he replied, positioning a log on the block. "I'm just impressed." He swung the axe, cleaving the wood with a satisfying crack despite the twinge in his shoulder. Working steadily, he established a rhythm, aware of Grace's eyes on him. After a while, she seemed satisfied with his progress and returned to the cabin, leaving him to his task. By midday, Abram had built up a considerable pile of split wood. Sweat dampened his borrowed shirt despite the cool air, and his shoulder ached, but the physical labor felt good after days of running and hiding. It kept his mind from darker thoughts, from memories of the night at the Rusty Nail Saloon when everything had gone so terribly wrong. He was stacking the last of the wood when Grace emerged from the cabin, a canteen in hand. She approached, offering him the water without comment. Abram drank deeply, then handed it back with a nod of thanks. "What else needs doing?" "That's enough for today," she said, eyeing his shoulder. "Don't want to open that wound again. Besides, I need to make a trip to my trading post. It's about an hour's ride from here." "You're going to leave me alone at your cabin?" Abram asked, surprised by the trust this implied. Grace's lips curved in a half-smile. "I'm taking your gun with me, and the only horse is mine. Where exactly would you go?" "Fair point. Besides," she added, her expression growing more serious, "I suspect if you wanted to rob or harm me, you'd have done so already." Abram nodded, acknowledging the truth in her assessment. "I'll be here when you return. See that you are." She started toward the barn, then paused, looking back. "And Abram, if anyone comes while I'm gone, anyone at all, there's a space under the floorboards beneath the bed. It's tight, but it'll hide a man your size." The casual way she offered this information, this protection, struck him deeply. "Thank you, Grace." She shrugged off his gratitude with a small gesture. "Just looking out for my investment. I've already used good bandages and medicine on you. Hate to see that go to waste." With that, she continued to the barn. Minutes later, she emerged on horseback, a sturdy chestnut mare that regarded Abram with suspicious eyes as they passed. Grace offered a small wave, then urged the horse into a trot, disappearing into the trees. Alone in the clearing, Abram took a moment to truly examine his surroundings. The cabin was strategically placed backed against a rise that provided natural protection, with clear sightlines in most directions. The stream provided water, and judging by the small garden plot to one side, Grace grew some of her own food. It was a well-thought-out homestead, the work of someone who understood survival. Inside the cabin, Abram noticed details he'd missed earlier. Shelves held books more than he would have expected alongside practical items. A Winchester rifle hung on pegs above the door, unloaded but within easy reach. Small touches of femininity were present too. A colorful quilt on the bed, dried wildflowers in a jar on the table, a delicate china cup among the utilitarian dishware. His exploration revealed a woman of contradictions, practical yet appreciative of beauty, independent yet apparently lonely enough to shelter a fugitive. The mystery of Grace Norwood deepened, and Abram found himself increasingly curious about the story that had led her to this solitary existence. True to his word, Abram was still at the cabin when Grace returned late in the afternoon, her saddlebags full and her expression troubled. She dismounted quickly, scanning the trees before leading her horse to the barn. "Everything all right?" Abram asked, meeting her at the barn door. "Marshall's men were at the trading post again," she said, removing the saddle from her mare. "They're expanding their search. Seems you've become quite important to them." Abram's jaw tightened. "I should go. I'm putting you at risk by staying. Don't be foolish." Grace brushed past him, carrying her saddlebags toward the cabin. "You're still injured, and they're watching all the trails now. Besides, no one connects me to you." Inside, she unpacked her supplies: flour, coffee, bullets for her rifle, and several newspapers. She handed one to Abram without comment. The front page of the Evanston Register featured his likeness and a bold headline. "Forrester still at large, $500 reward offered." The article beneath described him as armed and dangerous, wanted for the murder of 3 men at the Rusty Nail Saloon. "They've doubled the reward," Abram noted grimly, scanning the text. "Seems I'm becoming more valuable by the day." "Are you?" Grace asked quietly, watching him. "Valuable, that is?" Abram looked up, meeting her gaze. "I didn't kill those men, Grace. I was there, yes. I drew my gun, yes. But the shots came from behind me by the door. Someone used the confrontation as cover for their own purposes, then slipped away in the chaos." "Why would anyone do that?" "Because one of the dead men was Senator Crawford's son," Abram explained, sitting heavily at the table. "He was passing through on his way to meet his father in Salt Lake City. I think he was the target all along. The other 2 were just unfortunate additions." Grace considered this, her expression thoughtful. "And no one believed your version of events. The senator has influence, and I—" Abram hesitated. "I have a reputation, former Texas Ranger turned bounty hunter, not exactly a trustworthy character in most people's eyes." "But not a murderer," Grace said, more statement than question. "No, not a murderer." The simple validation in her words warmed something cold inside him. "Thank you for believing me." Grace nodded once, then turned to the stove. "Well, you're welcome to hide here until this blows over or until your name is cleared, whichever comes first. It might be a long wait," Abram warned. "Without proof, my word means nothing against the senator's influence." "Then it's fortunate I'm a patient woman." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "And that I have plenty of wood that needs chopping in the meantime." Despite the gravity of his situation, Abram found himself smiling again. There was something about Grace Norwood that cut through the darkness that had surrounded him for so long, something straightforward and real that reached past his defenses. As they shared a simple dinner that evening, Abram found himself watching Grace's hands as she worked strong and capable, but with an underlying gentleness. Those same hands had tended his wound, offered him water, and now broke bread to share with him. Small kindnesses that felt monumental after years of solitude. "Why did you become a bounty hunter?" Grace asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Abram considered the question, taking a sip of coffee before answering. "It seemed a natural progression from being a ranger. I was good at tracking, good with a gun, and I believed in justice, in bringing in those who had done wrong." Believed, past tense, his mouth tightened. 2 years ago I brought in a man for robbery, Hank Miller. He swore he was innocent, but the evidence was compelling and the reward was substantial. They hanged him 3 days later. Abram stared into his cup, seeing not the dark liquid but a man's desperate face. A month after, the real robber was caught with the stolen goods, confessing to the crime. Hank had been telling the truth. Grace's expression softened with understanding. "So you quit?" "I quit," Abram confirmed. "Took to drifting, doing odd jobs, became the cold cowboy as some called me, kept to myself, trusted no one. Until that night at the Rusty Nail when history seemed determined to repeat itself, another innocent man blamed for something he didn't do." "Except this time it's you," Grace said softly. Abram nodded, meeting her eyes. "Ironic, isn't it? Perhaps it's an opportunity," she suggested. "To right a wrong not just for yourself, but in memory of Hank Miller." Her words struck him deeply, offering perspective he hadn't considered. Before he could respond, a sharp knock at the door froze them both. Grace rose quickly, gesturing for Abram to move. "Under the bed," she whispered. "Now." Abram didn't argue, sliding beneath the bed and into the concealed space she'd mentioned earlier. Above him, he heard Grace compose herself, then open the door. "Evening, Miss Norwood." A man's voice, unfamiliar to Abram. "Sorry to disturb you so late." "Deputy Collins," Grace replied, her tone neutral. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Marshal's orders. We're checking all outlying homesteads for this fella." A pause, and Abram imagined the deputy showing Grace the wanted poster. "Dangerous man, killed 3 people in Evanston." "I heard," Grace said, "at the trading post today, but I haven't seen anyone matching that description." "Mind if I take a look around, just to be sure?" Abram held his breath, acutely aware of how vulnerable his position was if the deputy decided to search thoroughly. "Actually, Deputy, I do mind," Grace said firmly. "It's late, I'm preparing for bed, and I value my privacy. I've told you I haven't seen this man, and that should be sufficient." "Miss Norwood, with all due respect, Deputy Collins," Grace interrupted, her voice taking on a steel edge Abram hadn't heard before. "My father served as a judge in Illinois for 30 years. He taught me a great deal about the law, including the fact that you need a warrant to search a person's home without their permission. Do you have such a warrant?" A pause, then a grudging, "No, madam." "Then I believe our conversation is concluded. If I see this Forrester person, I'll certainly send word to town. Good night, Deputy." The sound of the door closing was followed by silence. Abram waited, listening for the deputy's departure. After several minutes, Grace's face appeared, peering under the bed. "He's gone," she whispered. Rode off toward town. Abram crawled out from his hiding place, dust clinging to his clothes. That was impressive, thank you. Grace shrugged, but the tension in her shoulders belied her casual response. They'll be back, probably with a warrant next time. We need to consider our options. Our options? Abram echoed, struck by the plural pronoun. Grace, this is my problem, not yours. You've already done more than enough. And now I'm involved, she countered. Besides, I've never been one to leave things half-finished. If I'm harboring a fugitive, I might as well help clear his name. The matter-of-fact way she stated this, as if helping a wanted man prove his innocence was simply another chore to be completed, left Abram momentarily speechless. Why? He finally asked. Why risk everything for someone you barely know? Grace met his gaze steadily. Because sometimes doing the right thing means taking a risk, and because... She hesitated, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her features. Because in 3 years of living out here, you're the first person who's made me feel less alone. The honesty of her admission hung in the air between them, creating a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Abram felt something shift inside him, a wall beginning to crumble, letting in light where there had been only darkness. We'll need evidence, he said at last, accepting her help and all it implied. Something to prove I didn't fire those fatal shots. Grace nodded, practical once more. Start by telling me everything about that night, every detail, no matter how small. They sat at the table as Abram recounted the events at the Rusty Nail Saloon. His argument with a local rancher over a card game, the escalation that led to both men drawing weapons, the confusion as shots rang out from behind, and the chaos that followed as people realized the senator's son lay dead among the victims. 3 men died, Abram explained. The rancher I was arguing with, an Eastern businessman who'd been watching our game, and Crawford's son, who'd been sitting at a table near the door. And you're certain the shots came from behind you? Grace asked, frowning in concentration. Positive. I had my gun drawn but never fired. The shots came from the direction of the door. In the confusion, whoever did it must have slipped away. Grace drummed her fingers on the table, thinking. Were there witnesses who might have seen something, someone who wasn't focused on you and the rancher? The bartender, Abram said suddenly, remembering. Samuel, I think his name was. He was facing the door, wiping glasses. If anyone saw something, it would be him. Then we need to talk to Samuel, Grace declared. But obviously, you can't show your face in Evanston. And you can't ask such questions without raising suspicion, Abram pointed out. Grace's lips curved into a small, determined smile. Perhaps not as myself, but I have an idea. For now, though, we should rest. Tomorrow will require clear heads. As they prepared for sleep, Abram again insisting on taking the pallet near the fireplace, a new awareness existed between them. The shared secret, the mutual risk, had created a bond neither had anticipated. Grace, Abram said softly as she blew out the lamp. Yes, whatever happens, thank you. For believing me, for helping me, for, he struggled to find the right words, for seeing me as more than the cold cowboy. In the darkness, he couldn't see her expression, but her voice carried a warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. Perhaps we both needed to be seen, Abram. Good night, Grace. As he drifted toward sleep, Abram realized that for the first time in years he felt something like hope stirring in his chest, and something else, something warmer and more dangerous that he wasn't yet ready to name. The next morning brought rain, a steady, soaking downpour that turned the ground outside to mud and filled the cabin with the rhythmic sound of droplets striking the roof. Any plans involving a trip to town were temporarily delayed, leaving Abram and Grace confined to the small space they now shared. Weather's a blessing in disguise, Grace observed, looking out the window at the gray curtain of rain. Gives your shoulder more time to heal and makes it less likely we'll have visitors. Abram nodded, accepting the cup of coffee she offered, though it doesn't help us gather evidence. No, but it gives us time to plan. She sat across from him at the table, her own cup warming her hands. I've been thinking about how to approach Samuel without raising suspicion. And a smile played at the corners of her mouth. How convincing do you think I'd be as a wealthy widow from Denver? Abram raised an eyebrow, studying her. With her practical clothing and sun-touched skin, Grace hardly resembled a city-dwelling widow. Yet there was an intelligence in her eyes, a dignity in her bearing that suggested she could play many roles if required. With the right clothing and approach, very convincing, he decided. But what's your plan? Samuel won't talk to someone he suspects of helping you, Grace explained. But a wealthy widow interested in purchasing the rusty nail, that's different. Business talk often leads to other discussions like the unfortunate incident that might affect the saloon's reputation and value. Abram considered the strategy. It could work. But you'd need appropriate attire, documentation to support your story. I have a trunk of my mother's things, Grace said. And I'm handy with a pen. Give me a day to prepare, and Mrs. Alina Thornton of Denver will be ready to make an appearance in Evanston. The confidence with which she outlined this deception impressed Abram. You've done this sort of thing before, a shadow crossed Grace's face. Let's just say I learned early that sometimes wearing a mask is necessary for survival. Before he could press for details, she stood and moved to a large trunk in the corner of the cabin. Opening it revealed folded fabrics, bits of lace, and items that seemed at odds with the frontier woman who had rescued him. My mother was a society lady from Boston, Grace explained, sensing his confusion. She never quite adjusted to frontier life, but she brought her wardrobe with her, hoping for opportunities to wear it. Most of it remained packed away until she died. I'm sorry, Abram said softly. It was a long time ago. Grace selected a dark blue dress from the trunk. Influenza took both my parents within a week of each other. I was 17. She spoke matter-of-factly, but Abram sensed the pain beneath her words. Is that when you came here, after they passed? Grace shook her head, draping the dress over a chair to examine it. No, that came later, after I discovered my fiancé was more interested in my father's estate than in me. The pieces of her story began to fit together why a young woman would choose such isolation, why she might be reluctant to trust. Like him, she had been wounded by betrayal. What happened? He asked gently, Grace's hands stilled on the fabric. I caught him discussing with his father how quickly they could sell my parents' property once we were married. They didn't know I was listening. Her voice hardened. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it, said it was a sensible plan that a woman couldn't manage such assets alone. So you proved him wrong, Abram guessed. I sold everything myself, she confirmed, a fierce pride entering her voice. Used the money to buy the trading post in this land, came west where no one knew me or had expectations about who I should be. Brave, Abram observed. Most women in your position would have accepted their fate. I'm not most women, Grace replied, meeting his eyes with a challenge in her gaze. No, Abram agreed, holding that gaze, you most certainly are not. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Two people who had chosen solitude rather than compromise, who had built walls to protect themselves from further hurt. The rain continued throughout the day, giving them time to refine their plan. Grace altered her mother's dress to fit her frame, while Abram helped craft the backstory for Alina Thornton, a widow whose late husband had invested in several successful saloons in Denver, leaving her with both wealth and a desire to continue his business ventures. Working together created a strange domesticity, an ease that felt both foreign and familiar to Abram. He found himself watching Grace as she sewed, the concentration in her expression, the deft movements of her fingers, the occasional smile when something amused her. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to simply enjoy another person's company. As evening approached and the rain finally eased, they sat before the fireplace sharing a simple meal. The warmth of the flames cast a golden glow over the cabin, softening the edges of their temporary sanctuary. Tell me about Texas, Grace said, setting aside her empty plate. What was it like being a ranger? Abram leaned back, memories surfacing that he hadn't revisited in years. Hard work. Dangerous at times, but there was purpose in it, protecting settlers, upholding the law in places where law was often just a word. Did you have family there? Once, he said quietly. My parents had a small ranch outside San Antonio. They died in a Comanche raid when I was 15. My sister and I survived because we were in town that day. Grace's eyes reflected sympathy but not pity. Your sister, where is she now? Married to a doctor in St. Louis, has 2 children I've never met. Abram stared into the flames. We write occasionally, but… After what happened with Hank Miller, I stopped responding. Didn't want my shame touching her life. That wasn't shame, Abram. It was a mistake, a terrible one, yes, but still just a mistake. Running from it doesn't change that. Her words struck close to truths he'd been avoiding. Maybe not. But it seemed easier than facing it. Easier, perhaps, but not better. Grace's voice was gentle but firm. Trust me, I know something about running away. Abram looked up at her. Is that how you see yourself, running away? Sometimes, she admitted. On the darkest nights when the silence gets too heavy. I tell myself I chose freedom, independence, but there are moments when I wonder if I just chose the easier path, isolation, over risking being hurt again. The honesty of her confession resonated deep within Abram. He'd told himself similar lies, justified his solitude as strength rather than fear. And now, he asked, do you regret your choice? Grace considered the question, her gaze thoughtful. No, I've built something here, something that's mine. But lately I've been thinking that perhaps there's a middle path, a way to maintain independence without complete isolation. Their eyes met across the small space, and Abram felt a tension that had nothing to do with his fugitive status or their plan to clear his name. It was something more primal, more personal, a recognition of possibility. It's getting late, Grace said finally, breaking the moment, and tomorrow will be a long day if the weather holds. Abram nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how intimate the cabin felt in the firelight. Yes, of course. As they prepared for sleep once more, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken words. Abram watched as Grace braided her hair for the night, the simple domestic act striking him as unexpectedly beautiful. Grace, he said as she turned down the lamp. Yes. Be careful tomorrow. If anyone suspects you're helping me. She smiled, the dim light casting shadows across her face. I'm always careful, Abram. It's how I've survived this long on my own. As darkness fell over the cabin, Abram lay awake, listening to the gentle sounds of Grace's breathing. The woman sleeping just a few feet away had become impossibly important to him in the span of just days, not just because she was his protector, his ally in clearing his name, but because she had somehow begun to thaw the ice around his heart. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. Morning brought clear skies and renewed purpose. Grace rose early, transforming herself into a leaner Thornton with methodical precision. The dark blue dress, though slightly outdated in style, gave her an air of respectability. She pinned her auburn hair into a sophisticated arrangement, added a small hat with a delicate veil, and completed the look with gloves and a reticule containing business documents they had created the previous evening. Standing before Abram in her completed disguise, Grace barely resembled the frontier woman who had threatened him with a shotgun days earlier. What do you think? She asked, turning slowly. Convincing, Abram found himself momentarily speechless. The dress highlighted the graceful curve of her waist, the proud set of her shoulders. She looked elegant, composed, and utterly beautiful. Very, he managed finally. You look like you could buy and sell the entire town of Evanston. She laughed, the sound brightening the cabin. That's the idea. Now remember, I'll be gone most of the day. Stay inside, keep the door locked, and use the hiding place if anyone comes. Yes, madam, Abram replied with mock seriousness. I promise to be a model fugitive in your absence. Her expression softened. Be safe, Abram. I'll return as soon as I can. On impulse, he reached for her hand, clasping it gently. You be safe too, Grace. For a moment they stood connected, neither speaking. Then Grace squeezed his hand once before releasing it, nodding briskly as if to dispel the emotion of the moment. I'll bring supplies back, she said, moving toward the door, and hopefully information. Abram watched from the window as she mounted her horse, sitting side saddle in deference to her fine dress. She looked back once, raising her hand in farewell, then urged the mare forward, disappearing into the trees. The cabin felt immediately emptier without her presence. Abram moved restlessly through the small space, checking his revolver, returned to him that morning as a precaution, adding wood to the fire, and finally settling at the table with one of Grace's books, a well-worn copy of The Last of the Mohicans. The hours passed slowly, each sound from outside causing him to tense, ready to dive for the hiding place beneath the bed. But no visitors came, and gradually the sun began its westward journey, casting long shadows across the clearing. By late afternoon, Abram's concern had grown into something approaching anxiety. Grace should have returned by now. Had something gone wrong? Had she been recognized, discovered? The possibilities multiplied in his mind, each more alarming than the last. He was pacing by the window, contemplating the unthinkable riding into Evanston himself to look for her when the sound of hoofbeats reached him. Relief flooded through him as Grace appeared at the edge of the clearing, still in her blue dress, still safely alone. Abram met her at the door as she dismounted, noting immediately the bright animation in her eyes. "You found something," he said, helping her with the saddlebags. "Better than something," she replied, her voice hushed with excitement despite their isolation. "I found someone." "Samuel is willing to talk to you." Abram stared at her in disbelief. "Talk to me, but I'm wanted, he knows," Grace interrupted, moving past him into the cabin. "And he believes you're innocent. More importantly, he saw something that night, something he was afraid to mention until now." Inside, Grace quickly shed her hat and gloves, seemingly eager to return to her normal self. As she unpinned her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders, she explained her day in Evanston. "Eleanor Thornton was quite the success," she said with a small smile. "The banker practically tripped over himself to introduce me around town. When I mentioned interest in the rusty nail, he arranged an immediate meeting with the owner who, it turns out, is eager to sell after the unfortunate incident damaged the saloon's reputation." "And Samuel?" Abram prompted, fascinated by her account but anxious for the critical information. "Samuel was serving drinks when I arrived. I arranged a private meeting with him, claiming I wanted an employee's honest assessment of the establishment." Grace's eyes sparkled with the thrill of her successful deception. "Once alone, I took a calculated risk and revealed my true purpose. Fortunately, my instincts were correct." "What did he tell you?" Grace sat at the table, inviting Abram to join her. "He confirmed your version of events, that the fatal shots came from behind you near the door, but he also saw who fired them, a man named Victor Reed." The name meant nothing to Abram. "Who is he?" "A hired gun, according to Samuel. He'd been in town for about a week before the shooting, keeping mostly to himself. Samuel noticed him because he never drank, just nursed the same whiskey for hours, watching everyone. And Samuel saw him fire the shots," Grace nodded. "He was wiping glasses facing the door. Saw Reed draw and fire just as you and the rancher squared off. In the confusion after, Reed slipped away." "But why wouldn't Samuel tell the marshal this immediately?" Abram asked, frustration edging his voice. "Fear," Grace said simply. The day after the shooting, Reed visited Samuel at his home, made it clear that speaking up would result in his death and his wife's. With a new baby at home, Samuel chose silence. Abram ran a hand through his hair, processing this information. "So Reed deliberately used my confrontation as cover. The question is, who hired him? And why target the senator's son?" "Samuel doesn't know," Grace admitted, "but he's willing to make a sworn statement now. Reed left town the day after visiting him, and Samuel's had no sign of him since." "It's still his word against a powerful senator's influence," Abram pointed out. "We need more." "Perhaps," Grace agreed, "but it's a start. And I have more news. Samuel is willing to meet with you tonight, in town." "That's too dangerous." "No, at his home. It's on the outskirts of Evanston. His shift ends at midnight, and his place is isolated enough that you can approach unseen." Grace reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "This could be your chance, Abram, to clear your name, to stop running." The hope in her voice was palpable, matching the cautious optimism rising within him. Could it really be possible? After weeks of being hunted, could the truth finally emerge? "All right," he decided. "I'll meet with Samuel, but you should stay here, it's safer." Grace's expression hardened immediately. "I'm coming with you," "This is our plan, Abram. We see it through together." "Grace, no," she interrupted firmly. "I didn't take these risks just to be left behind at the critical moment. Besides, Samuel is expecting both of us." Abram recognized the determination in her eyes, the same determination that had led her to build a life alone in the wilderness, to defy conventions, to help a wanted man. Arguing would be futile. "Together, then," he conceded, his tone softening as he looked at her, this remarkable woman who had appended his solitary existence in less than a week. "But we'll need to be extremely careful." As they prepared for the night's journey, gathering weapons and planning their approach, Abram found himself watching Grace with a growing awareness. In helping him, she had awakened something he'd thought long dead, not just hope for his future, but a desire for that future to include her. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange calm, a sense of rightness he couldn't explain. They left the cabin shortly after sunset, riding double on Grace's mare Abram behind the saddle, his arms around Grace's waist to maintain balance. The closeness was necessary but distracting. The warmth of her body against his a constant reminder of how quickly she had come to matter to him. The night was clear and cold. Stars spread across the black velvet sky like diamonds. They rode in silence, alert for any sign of other travelers, but the trail remained empty. As they approached Evanston, Grace guided the horse away from the main road, taking smaller paths that skirted the town proper. "Samuel's place is just ahead," she whispered eventually, pointing to a small house set back from the trail, a single light glowing in its window. They dismounted a safe distance away, securing the horse to a tree. Moving cautiously through the shadows, they approached the modest cabin that served as Samuel's home. Before they could knock, the door opened slightly and a nervous face peered out. "Miss Norwood," Samuel's voice was hushed, anxious. "You came, as promised," Grace replied softly. "And I've brought Mr. Forrester." Samuel glanced quickly at Abram, then opened the door wider, ushering them inside. The interior was simple but comfortable, warmed by a small fire. A young woman, presumably Samuel's wife, sat in a rocking chair, a sleeping infant in her arms. She nodded warily at the visitors but said nothing. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," Abram said, keeping his voice low out of respect for the sleeping child. "Grace tells me you saw what really happened that night." Samuel nodded, his thin face solemn. "I did. And I'm ashamed it's taken me this long to speak up." "You were protecting your family," Grace said gently. "Anyone would understand that." "Maybe," Samuel glanced at his wife and child, "but a man's been falsely accused because of my silence. That ain't right." He gestured for them to sit at a small table, then joined them, his hands clasped nervously before him. "I'll tell you everything I saw, and I'm willing to make a sworn statement to the marshal, but there's something else you should know, something I only learned today." Abram leaned forward, sensing important information. "Go on." "Reed's back in town," Samuel said, his voice dropping even lower. "Came into the saloon this afternoon, bold as brass, and he wasn't alone. He was meeting with Howard Jenkins." The name hit Abram like a physical blow. Jenkins. "You're certain?" Samuel nodded firmly. "No mistake. They sat in the corner, talking quiet like for near an hour." Grace looked between the two men, confusion evident. "Who is Howard Jenkins?" "Senator Crawford's campaign manager," Abram explained, his mind racing with implications. "And his right-hand man for over a decade. You think Jenkins hired Reed to kill Crawford's son?" Grace asked, the pieces falling into place. "But why would he target his employer's own child?" "I don't know," Abram admitted. "But if Jenkins and Reed are meeting openly, they must believe they're safe, that I'll hang for their crime." Samuel cleared his throat. "There's talk that the marshal's bringing in extra men. They aim to search every homestead, every cabin within 30 miles of Evanston. They're determined to find you, Mr. Forrester." The news sent a chill through Abram. Grace's cabin wouldn't remain a sanctuary for long. "When is this search happening?" Grace asked, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "Day after tomorrow," Samuel replied. "They're gathering men from neighboring towns." Abram exchanged a glance with Grace, both recognizing the urgency this timeline created. They needed to act quickly, but how? Even with Samuel's testimony, it might not be enough to overcome the senator's influence, especially if Jenkins was involved. "We need evidence," Abram said, thinking aloud. "Something that proves the connection between Jenkins and Reed, something that explains why Jenkins would want Crawford's son dead." Samuel hesitated, then spoke reluctantly. "There are rumors about young Crawford. That he discovered something unsavory about his father's business dealings, something involving Jenkins." "What kind of something?" Grace pressed. "I don't rightly know," Samuel admitted, "but Jenkins keeps a safe in his office above the bank. If there's evidence, that's where it would be." The information hung in the air between them, the implicit suggestion clear. Breaking into Jenkins' office might provide the proof they needed, but it would also be incredibly dangerous. Before any of them could speak further, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the thin walls of the cabin. Samuel's wife gasped, clutching their child closer. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. Samuel moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. His face paled. "It's the marshal and 2 deputies." "Is there another way out?" Abram asked, already on his feet. Samuel nodded, pointing to a back door. "Through there, but your horse is hidden well enough," Grace assured him, gathering her shawl. "What will you tell them?" "That I haven't seen either of you," Samuel said firmly. "Now go, quickly." Abram hesitated, turning back to the frightened bartender. "Thank you, Samuel. Whatever happens, I won't forget this." They slipped out the back door just as knocking sounded at the front. Moving silently through the darkness, they made their way to where Grace's horse waited. Only when they were a safe distance from Samuel's home did they pause to catch their breath. "That was close," Grace whispered, her hand finding Abram's in the darkness. "Too close," he agreed, squeezing her fingers gently. "And it'll only get worse when they start searching systematically. We need to resolve this quickly." Grace looked up at him, her face pale in the moonlight. "You're thinking about Jenkins' safe." It wasn't a question, but Abram nodded anyway. "It may be our only chance. If there's something there that connects him to Reed or explains why Crawford's son was targeted. Then we need to get to it before the search begins," Grace finished. Her expression was determined, showing no fear despite the risk. "I know Evanston well. The bank has a back entrance that's only lightly secured." Abram stared at her in surprise. "You're suggesting we break in tonight? Do we have a better option?" she challenged. "Or a better time? Most of the law is currently at Samuel's, thinking they might find you there." The logic was sound if dangerous, and time was running out not just for clearing his name but for his sanctuary with Grace. Once the widespread search began, returning to her cabin would put her at too much risk. "All right," he decided, "but we do this carefully. At the first sign of trouble, we abort." They mounted the horse together once more, this time taking a wide berth around Evanston before approaching from the east, where buildings provided more shadows for concealment. Leaving the horse secured in an alley, they moved on foot toward the imposing brick building that housed the town bank. The streets were mostly deserted at this hour, with only the occasional patron stumbling from one of the saloons still operating. Oil lamps cast pools of yellow light at intervals, leaving plenty of darkness between for Abram and Grace to navigate unseen. "There," Grace whispered, pointing to a narrow passage beside the bank. "That leads to the back door. The upper floor has offices, including Jenkins." They slipped into the passage, hugging the wall until they reached the rear entrance. As Grace had predicted, security was minimal, a single padlock that Abram was able to pick using skills from his ranger days. Inside, they found themselves in a small storeroom. Abram drew his revolver, holding it ready as they crept through the darkened bank toward the stairs leading to the upper floor. Every creak of the floorboards seemed magnified in the silence, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. The second floor contained several offices, their doors bearing brass nameplates. Jenkins' office was at the end of the hall, its heavy oak door locked. Once again, Abram's lock-picking skills proved valuable, though this mechanism was more complex than the padlock below. With a soft click, the door finally yielded, swinging inward to reveal a well-appointed office. Moonlight streamed through a large window, illuminating a massive desk, several bookshelves, and on the far wall a safe. "Keep watch at the door," Abram instructed Grace in a whisper. "This might take some time." She nodded, moving to a position where she could observe the hallway while Abram approached the safe. It was a high-quality model, the kind used to protect valuable documents rather than large sums of cash. Breaking into it without the combination would be challenging, possibly impossible in the limited time they had. Abram examined the desk first, hoping to find the combination written down somewhere, a common practice, despite the security risk it posed. The drawers contained correspondence, ledgers, and various official-looking documents, but nothing that appeared to be safe instructions. As he carefully searched through the papers, a name caught his eye: Victor Reed. Abram pulled the document closer to the window, using the moonlight to read its contents. It was a contract, unsigned but clearly outlining terms for a service to be performed for a substantial sum. The language was carefully vague, but to Abram's experienced eyes it was unmistakably a contract for murder. And while the target wasn't named directly, the timing matched perfectly with young Crawford's death. "Grace," he called softly, excitement building. "I've found something." She moved from her post to join him, examining the document over his shoulder. "Is this enough?" she asked, her breath warm against his ear. Maybe, but Abram's response was cut short by the sound of voices from the street below. They both froze, then moved carefully to the window. Below, Marshal Davies and his deputies had returned to town. They were conversing with another man, Howard Jenkins himself, identifiable even from above by his distinctive top hat. "They're heading for the bank," Grace whispered urgently. "Look." Indeed, the group was moving toward the bank's main entrance. They had perhaps minutes before being discovered. "We need to go, now." Abram quickly folded the contract, tucking it securely inside his shirt. "This will have to be enough." They moved swiftly back to the hallway, closing Jenkins' office door behind them. Below, they could hear the main door opening, voices growing louder. "The back stairs," Grace whispered, pointing to a narrower staircase at the opposite end of the hall, likely used by cleaning staff. They had just reached it when light flooded the lower level, footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. Moving as quietly as possible, they descended the service stairs, finding themselves in what appeared to be a small kitchen area used by bank employees. A window provided their escape route, opening onto the same alley where their horse waited. Abram helped Grace through first, then followed, pulling the window closed behind him to avoid immediate detection. They reached the horse just as shouts erupted from inside the bank. Their intrusion had been discovered. Without a word, Abram lifted Grace into the saddle, then swung up behind her. They galloped away from Evanston, taking a different route than their approach, leaving the sounds of alarm behind. Only when they were well clear of town did they slow to a trot, both breathing heavily from the exertion and fear. "You think it's enough?" Grace asked, referring to the document now hidden against Abram's chest. "Will it prove your innocence?" "It's evidence of Jenkins hiring Reed for something illegal," Abram replied, still processing what they'd found. "Combined with Samuel's testimony about seeing Reed fire the shots, it creates a compelling case." "But why?" Grace pressed. "Why would Jenkins want Crawford's son dead?" Abram considered the question, recalling Samuel's comment about rumors. Perhaps young Crawford discovered something: corruption, embezzlement. If he was planning to expose his father's right-hand man, Jenkins would have a motive to silence him, Grace finished. And to frame someone else for the crime. Exactly. Abram's arms tightened slightly around her waist as they rode. "The question now is, who do we take this to? Not Marshal Davies, he's clearly in Jenkins' pocket." "The territorial governor," Grace suggested after a moment's thought. "He's above local politics and would have the authority to investigate a senator's campaign manager." It was a sound plan, but implementing it would be challenging. The territorial governor resided in Cheyenne, over 100 miles away, a journey that would be difficult to complete before the expanded search for Abram began. "We'll need to leave at first light," Abram said, the reality of their situation settling over him. "Ride hard for Cheyenne." Grace nodded, but there was a hesitation in her posture that Abram could feel. "What about my trading post, my cabin?" The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the enormity of what Grace was risking for him. Her entire life, everything she had built, could be forfeit if they failed. "Grace," Abram began, his voice softening. "I can't ask you to, you're not asking," she interrupted. "I'm choosing, I just need to know what I'm choosing." They had reached her cabin, the familiar clearing a welcome sight after their narrow escape. Dismounting, Abram helped Grace down, their hands lingering together longer than necessary. In the silver moonlight, her face was a study in determination and vulnerability, a combination that pierced straight through the walls Abram had built around his heart. "I don't know what happens after Cheyenne," he admitted honestly. "If we succeed, my name is cleared, I can stop running, but beyond that—" He hesitated, uncertain how to express the feelings growing within him. Grace stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Beyond that, what do you want, Abram? More solitude, more drifting from place to place?" "No," he said softly, the answer coming more easily than he expected. "No more of that." "Then what?" The directness of her question demanded equal honesty in response. Abram took a deep breath, allowing himself to speak words he'd never thought he'd say again. "I want this," he said simply, gesturing to the cabin, the clearing, and finally to Grace herself. "A home, purpose, and someone to share it with, someone who sees me clearly and chooses me anyway." In the silence that followed, Abram could hear the rapid beating of his own heart, feel the vulnerability of having exposed his deepest desires. For a man who had lived behind emotional walls for so long, it was terrifying and exhilarating. Grace's expression softened, her hand rising to rest against his cheek. "Then that's what we're fighting for in Cheyenne," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just your name, but our future, our future." The words resonated through Abram like a physical force, breaking down the last of his resistance. Without conscious thought, he leaned forward, closing the space between them until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle, at first a question, an offering. When Grace responded, sliding her arms around his neck and drawing him closer, it deepened into something more urgent, more profound. All the tension, fear, and growing affection of the past days poured into this single connection, creating a moment of perfect understanding between them. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Abram rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected you," he confessed. "Never thought I'd find this." Grace smiled, her eyes bright in the moonlight. "The best things in life are rarely what we expect." Abram Forrester. Inside the cabin, as they prepared for their journey to Cheyenne, the atmosphere had changed. The uncertainty of their future remained, the danger still very real, but something new had been acknowledged between them, a commitment that transcended the immediate crisis. They spent the remaining hours of night gathering provisions, securing the document they had stolen, and making plans for the journey ahead. Dawn would bring new challenges, but for now, in this small cabin that had become a sanctuary for both of them, there was a sense of rightness that neither had felt in years. "Get some rest," Grace urged as the first hints of gray appeared in the eastern sky. "We have a long ride ahead." Abram nodded, but instead of moving to his pallet, he reached for her hand. "Whatever happens in Cheyenne," he said softly, "know that you've already saved me, Grace Norwood, not just from the marshal's noose, but from myself." She squeezed his fingers, her eyes speaking volumes that words could not. "And you've shown me that walls, no matter how carefully built, sometimes need to come down for life to truly begin." As they set out at first light, riding double once more on Grace's sturdy mare, Abram felt a curious peace despite the uncertainty before them. For the first time in years, he was riding toward something, not away from it, and the woman in his arms was the reason why. The journey to Cheyenne was arduous, taking them across rugged terrain and forcing them to avoid main trails where they might be recognized. They rode through the day and into the evening, making camp only when darkness made further progress impossible. Beside a small fire in a sheltered ravine, they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. The stars spread above them in a breathtaking display, a reminder of how small their troubles were in the grand scheme of creation. "Do you ever miss it?" Grace asked suddenly, gazing upward. "Texas, I mean." "Your life there?" Abram considered the question, poking at the fire with a stick. "Sometimes, not the place so much as the purpose, the certainty of knowing exactly who I was and what I was meant to do. And who are you now?" Her voice was soft, curious rather than challenging. "I'm still figuring that out," Abram admitted with a small smile. "But I think I might be someone who's finally ready to stop punishing himself for past mistakes, someone who's learning that isolation isn't the same as strength." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It took me a long time to realize that independence doesn't have to mean loneliness, that asking for help or wanting companionship isn't weakness. We're quite the pair, aren't we?" Abram observed wryly. "Both so determined to need no one that we nearly missed finding each other." "Nearly," Grace emphasized, reaching across to take his hand. "But not quite." They reached Cheyenne late the following day, dusty and exhausted from hard riding. The territorial capital was larger than Evanston, its streets busier, buildings grander. They found lodging in a small inn on the outskirts of town, where Abram's face was less likely to be recognized. "I'll make inquiries about meeting the governor," Grace said as they settled into the modest room they'd secured under her name. "Azalina Thornton, of course." A woman with business concerns might more easily gain an audience. Abram nodded, though concern lined his features. "Be careful if word of the bank break-in has reached here." "I will be," she promised, touching his cheek briefly before departing. Alone in the room, Abram paced restlessly. So much depended on the next few hours: his freedom, his future with Grace, perhaps even his life. The document they had stolen from Jenkins' office remained secure in an inner pocket of his shirt, its existence their main hope for vindication. Grace returned hours later, her expression triumphant despite the fatigue evident in her posture. "It's arranged," she announced. "Governor Warren will see us tomorrow morning." His secretary was quite taken with Mrs. Thornton's tale of fraud and corruption affecting her business interests. Relief flooded through Abram. "Both of us, even with my face on wanted posters." "I may have neglected to mention you specifically," Grace admitted with a small smile. "But once we're in his office with the evidence, I believe he'll listen before calling the authorities." The night passed slowly, both too tense for much sleep despite their exhaustion. They lay side by side on the narrow bed, hands clasped between them, speaking occasionally of inconsequential things, a deliberate avoidance of the uncertainty that awaited them at dawn. In the gray light of early morning, they dressed carefully, Abram in the cleanest clothes they could manage, Grace once again donning her Azalina Thornton persona. The document was checked and rechecked, their story rehearsed until both were confident. "Ready?" Grace asked, adjusting her hat one final time. Abram nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady himself. "As I'll ever be." The territorial governor's office occupied a stately building in the center of Cheyenne. They approached cautiously, alert for any sign that Abram had been recognized. But the busy streets provided anonymity, allowing them to reach their destination without incident. Inside, a secretary ushered them into a waiting area, barely glancing at Abram, further evidence of Grace's skills at creating a convincing pretext for their visit. They sat side by side on a bench, tension evident in their rigid postures. "Mrs. Thornton." The secretary reappeared after several minutes. "The governor will see you now." Rising, Grace gave Abram's hand a reassuring squeeze before they followed the man down a short hallway to an imposing door. It opened to reveal a spacious office, far grander than Jenkins in Evanston, where a distinguished-looking man sat behind a massive desk. Governor Francis Warren was younger than Abram had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and intelligent eyes. Those eyes narrowed slightly as they entered, his gaze lingering on Abram with a flicker of recognition. "Mrs. Thornton," he greeted, rising, "and companion, please be seated." As they took the offered chairs, Warren remained standing, moving to close his office door personally. The sound of the latch clicking into place had an ominous finality that made Abram tense. "Now," the governor said, returning to his desk. "My secretary mentioned concerns about fraud and corruption, but I suspect there's more to this visit than initially presented." "Isn't that right, Mr. Forrester?" The direct acknowledgement of his identity sent a chill through Abram. Beside him, Grace stiffened but maintained her composure. "Governor Warren," she began, her voice steady, "thank you for seeing us." "Yes, there is indeed more to our visit than I initially disclosed." Warren held up a hand, his expression neutral. "Before you continue, Mrs. Norwood," Grace supplied, abandoning her pretense. "Grace Norwood, Miss Norwood." "Before you continue, I should inform you that I received a telegram from Evanston yesterday evening. It seems there was a break-in at the town bank, specifically targeting the office of Howard Jenkins, Senator Crawford's campaign manager." Abram's hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, but Warren noticed the motion and shook his head slightly. "I'm not reaching for a weapon, Mr. Forrester, nor am I summoning guards, not yet at least. I'm merely establishing that I'm aware of recent events." The governor leaned back in his chair, studying them. "Now, I suggest you explain quickly why I shouldn't have you both arrested immediately." Sensing their narrow window of opportunity, Abram reached slowly into his shirt, retrieving the folded document. "We have evidence, Governor." "Evidence that Howard Jenkins hired a man named Victor Reed to commit murder, specifically the murder of Senator Crawford's son." Warren's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no move to take the offered paper. "That's a serious accusation against a powerful man. What possible motive could Jenkins have for such an act? We believe young Crawford discovered something incriminating about his father's campaign or business dealings," Grace explained. "Something that implicated Jenkins directly, and your evidence for this theory." Abram placed the document on the desk between them. "This contract, found in Jenkins' office, outlines terms for a service to be performed by Victor Reed, a known hired gun, for a substantial sum. The timing aligns perfectly with young Crawford's death. Additionally," Grace added, "we have a witness, the bartender at the Rusty Nail Saloon, who saw Reed fire the shots that killed Crawford and 2 others. This same witness can testify that Abram drew his weapon but never fired." Warren finally reached for the document, examining it with a critical eye. "This is circumstantial at best," he observed, though his tone suggested interest rather than dismissal. "A contract for unspecified services, a witness whose credibility could be questioned." "But enough to warrant investigation," Abram pressed. "Enough to look more closely at Jenkins rather than continuing to hunt an innocent man." The governor studied them both for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, he smiled slightly. "You know, Mr. Forrester, I've been following your case with some interest. A respected former Texas Ranger suddenly turning murderer never quite rang true to me." He tapped the document thoughtfully. "And I've had my own concerns about certain aspects of Senator Crawford's operations for some time." Hope stirred in Abram's chest. "Then you'll investigate?" "I'll do more than that," Warren decided, rising from his chair. "I'll send telegrams to the federal marshal in Salt Lake City and to Marshal Davies in Evanston. The former will be instructed to detain Jenkins for questioning. The latter will be ordered to cease pursuit of you pending further investigation." The relief that washed over Abram was so profound he momentarily closed his eyes. Beside him, Grace reached for his hand, her fingers curling tightly around his. "Of course," Warren continued, "you'll need to remain in Cheyenne until this matter is resolved, and your witness Samuel was it. We'll need to provide formal testimony." "He's willing," Grace assured him. "He was only silent out of fear for his family." "Understandable." The governor moved toward the door. "I'll have rooms arranged for you at the Cheyenne House Hotel. Consider yourselves guests of the territory until this situation is clarified." As they rose to follow him, Abram felt compelled to ask, "Why are you helping us, Governor? You could have had us arrested the moment we walked in." Warren paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Because justice matters, Mr. Forrester, even perhaps especially when powerful men are involved." he smiled slightly. And because I've learned to trust my instincts about people. You don't strike me as a murderer despite what the wanted posters claim. The following days passed in a blur of statements, interviews, and anxious waiting. Governor Warren proved true to his word, arranging comfortable accommodations for them while the investigation proceeded. Samuel was brought to Cheyenne under protection, his testimony recorded in detail. More significantly, a search of Jenkins' home in Evanston yielded additional evidence correspondence, suggesting young Crawford had indeed discovered financial irregularities involving campaign funds. The pieces fell into place rapidly once the correct questions were being asked. 5 days after their arrival in Cheyenne, Abram and Grace were summoned back to the governor's office. This time, the atmosphere was considerably less tense, Warren greeting them with a genuine smile as they entered. "Good news," he announced without preamble, "Jenkins has confessed." It seems Senator Crawford's son had discovered that his father's campaign manager was embezzling funds. When confronted privately, Jenkins arranged the young man's death rather than face exposure. "And Reid?" Abram asked. "Apprehended in Denver," Warren confirmed. "He's being returned to Wyoming to face charges. His testimony corroborates yours entirely. He fired from near the door while you were involved in an unrelated confrontation, specifically to create confusion about the source of the shots." The enormity of the moment washed over Abram. After weeks of being hunted, of living as a fugitive, his name would be cleared. The cold weight that had pressed against his chest for so long began to lift. "What happens now?" Grace asked, her hand finding Abram's as they stood before the governor's desk. "Now," Warren said, producing an official-looking document, "I sign this order formally exonerating Mr. Forrester of all charges related to the Evanston shootings. Compensation for wrongful pursuit will be arranged, and public notices of his innocence distributed throughout the territory." He dipped his pen in ink and signed with a flourish, then looked up at them with genuine warmth. "Congratulations, Mr. Forrester, you're a free man again." The words seemed to hang in the air, almost too significant to fully absorb. Abram felt Grace's hand tighten around his, grounding him in the moment, in the reality of what had been accomplished. "Thank you, Governor," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "for believing us, for pursuing the truth." "Thank your lady friend here," Warren replied with a smile toward Grace. Her determination was most persuasive. "Now I imagine you both have plans to make. You're free to return to Evanston or wherever you choose to go next." As they left the governor's office, stepping into the bright Wyoming sunshine, Abram felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The burden of false accusation had been lifted, the necessity of constant vigilance removed. For the first time since that fateful night at the Rusty Nail, he could breathe freely, walk openly, think about the future. And that future, he realized with absolute certainty, included the woman beside him. "So," Grace said as they paused on the steps of the government building. "Where to now, Mr. Newly exonerated Forrester?" Abram turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "That depends entirely on you, Miss Norwood. On me." Her eyebrows rose slightly, though the smile playing at her lips suggested she understood his meaning perfectly well. "Yes, on you." Abram stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure his words were for her alone. "Because wherever I go next, I hope it will be with you. Back to your cabin, to Evanston, to Texas, to the moon. I don't much care about the destination as long as we're together." Grace's smile widened, her green eyes bright with emotion. "Are you proposing something specific, Abram Forrester?" "I believe I am," he confirmed, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "Not just because you saved my life or my name, but because in that cabin, sharing that small space with you, I found something I thought was lost forever, a sense of home, of belonging." "The cold cowboy found his home," Grace murmured, echoing his sentiment. "With a woman who taught him how to be warm again," Abram finished, lifting a hand to touch her cheek gently. "So yes, Grace Norwood, I am proposing something very specific, that we build a life together wherever and however you wish." Grace's answer came not in words but in action, rising on her toes to press her lips to his, uncaring of the curious glances from passers-by. When she finally drew back, her eyes shone with happy tears. "I think," she said softly, "that I'd like to return to my cabin, our cabin, at least for now. It's a good place to begin." "Then that's where we'll go," Abram agreed, his heart fuller than he had believed possible after so many years of emptiness. They returned to Evanston 3 days later, riding side by side rather than double as they had on their flight to Cheyenne. The town that had been a place of danger for Abram now received him differently, with curious glances rather than hostile ones, with whispers of "that's the man they falsely accused," rather than "that's the murderer." News traveled quickly in frontier communities, and the story of Jenkins' confession had preceded their return. Some citizens even offered apologies or congratulations as they passed through town, though Abram noted the marshal was conspicuously absent from these well-wishers. They visited Samuel first, finding him at home with his wife and child. The young family's relief at seeing them safe was palpable, as was their gratitude for the financial compensation Governor Warren had arranged for Samuel's testimony. "What will you do now?" Samuel asked as they prepared to leave. "Stay in Evanston." Abram glanced at Grace, who answered for them both. "We'll be at my cabin, at least for now. Visitors welcome, though advance notice is appreciated." The implication of their shared future wasn't lost on Samuel, who grinned broadly. "About time you found someone, Miss Norwood. And you too, Mr. Forrester." As they rode the familiar trail toward Grace's their cabin, the beauty of the Wyoming wilderness seemed more vivid than before. Every aspen, every pine, every distant mountain peak appeared somehow enhanced by the knowledge that they were returning not as fugitives, but as free people with a future stretching before them. "It feels different," Grace observed as they entered the clearing where the cabin stood, just as they had left it. "Coming back this way?" Abram nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Everything feels different when you're riding toward something instead of away from it. They dismounted before the porch, taking a moment to simply absorb the scene: the cabin that had been sanctuary, the meadow surrounding it, the mountains beyond. Their beginning. "What now?" Grace asked softly, her shoulder brushing his as they stood side by side. Abram smiled, taking her hand and leading her toward the cabin door. "Now, Grace Norwood, we begin, together." 6 months later, spring had transformed the landscape around the cabin. Wildflowers dotted the meadow, aspen trees displayed fresh green leaves, and the stream gurgled with renewed vigor from snowmelt. The cabin itself had undergone changes to a new lean-to for additional storage, improved chinked walls for better insulation, and expanded garden plots that Grace tended with care. Inside, the single room remained simple, but had evolved to reflect its dual occupancy. Abram's books now shared shelf space with Grace's. His carved wooden figures, a hobby discovered during winter evenings, adorned the mantel. The narrow bed had been replaced with one built by Abram's own hands, large enough for two. Most significantly, a gold band now circled Grace's finger, matching the one on Abram's symbols of the vows they had exchanged before a small gathering of friends 3 months earlier. Samuel and his family had attended, as had Governor Warren, whose support had transformed into genuine friendship. Even Abram's sister had journeyed from St. Louis, tearfully reuniting with the brother she had feared lost to solitude forever. "Letters," Grace called, entering the cabin with several envelopes. "From town." Abram looked up from the saddle he was repairing at the table, smiling at the sight of his wife. 6 months of proper nutrition and happiness had added a glow to her features that took his breath away daily. "Anything interesting?" he asked as she sorted through them. "One from your sister," Grace reported, "one from the governor, and—" she paused, her expression turning more serious, "one from Texas." Abram set aside his work, reaching for the letter she held out. The return address confirmed what the postmark suggested: it was from the Texas Rangers headquarters in Austin. "They've been persistent," Grace observed, setting the other letters down and moving to stand beside him. "This is the third inquiry," Abram nodded, breaking the seal. The Rangers had indeed been persistent in their attempts to recruit him back to their ranks, especially after the events in Evanston had garnered attention throughout the Western Territories. His name, once associated with disgrace, now carried renewed respect, something the Rangers clearly hoped to leverage. He scanned the contents quickly, then set the letter aside with a small shake of his head. Same offer as before. Position as a senior ranger, choice of assignments, increased salary. "And your answer remains the same?" Grace asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Abram reached for her hand, drawing her down to sit beside him. "My answer remains the same. My place is here with you. Building this life we've started." Relief and love mingled in her expression as she leaned against him. "I wouldn't hold you back if it was truly what you wanted, Abram. I hope you know that." "I do," he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But it's not what I want, not anymore." The Rangers were part of a different life, a solitary one. "This life, our life, means more to me than any badge or title." It was true. Though he occasionally accepted assignments from the territorial governor, tracking dangerous fugitives or investigating specific cases, these were temporary duties that always brought him back to the cabin, to Grace. Their home. "Besides," he added with a smile, "the trading post is thriving with both of us running it." "Why would I leave a successful business partnership?" Grace laughed, the sound still a joy to Abram's ears after years of silence and solitude. "Is that what we are, business partners?" "Among other things," he agreed, drawing her closer for a proper kiss. The trading post had indeed flourished under their joint management. Abram's reputation drew customers from far-flung homesteads, while Grace's practical knowledge of frontier needs ensured they stocked the right supplies. They alternated days there, maintaining the cabin and their privacy while still engaging with the wider community. It was a balance neither had thought possible during their solitary years, independence without isolation, connection without compromise. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Abram found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a wounded fugitive stumbling into a stranger's cabin to a man at peace, building a future with the woman who had seen worth in him when he had forgotten it himself. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grace asked, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Abram replied, his arm tightening around her. "A year ago, I was the cold cowboy everyone avoided, living day to day, trusting no one, expecting nothing. And now," he smiled, turning to meet her gaze, "now I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming territory. Possibly in all the western states and territories combined." Grace's laugh warmed him more than the spring evening required. "Such extravagant claims, Mr. Forrester, and what makes you so certain of your good fortune?" "This," he said simply, gesturing to the cabin behind them, the land around them, and finally to Grace herself. "All of this, but mostly you." The sincerity in his voice sobered her, her expression softening as she reached up to touch his face. "We saved each other, I think. Both hiding from life for different reasons, until circumstances forced us to remember what living actually means." Abram nodded, covering her hand with his own. "I used to think strength meant needing no one, standing alone regardless of the cost. And now," Grace prompted gently, "now I know true strength is found in connection, in trusting someone enough to share your burdens, your joys, your everyday moments." He smiled, the expression coming easily now after months of practice. "In building something together that neither could create alone." As darkness settled over their clearing, stars appearing one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, they remained on the porch, the former fugitive and the woman who had risked everything to help him. Their story had begun with danger and desperation, but had transformed into something neither had dared to hope for: a shared life, a true partnership, a love born of mutual respect and understanding. The cabin that had once been Grace's solitary refuge had become their home, a place where two people who had hidden from the world found something worth embracing it for. Together.